I know a lot of you are on the fence about spending big on a rack server, especially when the specs look like a billboard for a data center. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this review, I'll break down the HPE Proliant DL380 Gen 10 UC advertised as a super high-end virtualization server and try to answer the practical questions. Will it actually make my virtual machines run smoother? How much of that 192 gigabytes of RAM ends up usable day-to-day, and where the money is really going? First off, the category you're stepping into is the enterprise-grade 2U rack server space that normally serves a handful of VMs, a few storage arrays, and a constant stream of backup traffic. The DL380 is built around a 2.20 GHz Intel Xeon E5-2699V4, 22 physical cores, and 42 TB 7.2K SAS drives behind an HP Smart Array P440AR controller. It also ships with a 10 gigabits Ethernet adapter, dual 800W power supplies, and the rails you need to mount it in a rack. What that tells us in plain English is that the box is designed to hold a lot of memory, run many virtual CPUs, and keep the I/O flowing without choking on network bottlenecks. If you're running a small to medium business that already has a rack, a UPS, and a dedicated network segment for servers, the DL380 can be a solid foundation for a private cloud or a lab environment where you spin up dozens of Windows Server or Linux guests. The 22 cores are split into 44 threads with hyper-threading, which means you can allocate 2 virtual CPUs to each VM and still have headroom for the hypervisor. In practice, I've seen IT teams run anywhere from 8 to 12 VMs on a similar spec without seeing CPU ready times spike past 70%. That's because the Xeon's large cache and the 10 gigabits NIC keep the data moving fast enough that the guest OS rarely waits for the network. Memory is where the 192 gigabytes headline starts to matter. In a virtualized world, you often end up with a lot of reserved RAM that never gets touched, especially if you over-provision. The good news is HPE's BIOS lets you enable memory mirroring and NUMA awareness, which helps the hypervisor balance workloads across the 2 CPU sockets. Real-world testing shows you can safely allocate around 150 gigabytes for active VMs and keep 2030 gigabytes as a safety buffer for the host OS and any unexpected spikes. If you need more than that, you'll have to add another DIMM kit, but the board already supports up to 384 gigabytes, so you're not boxed in. Storage is a mixed bag. The 42 TB 7.2K SAS drives give you roughly 8 TB of raw capacity, but they're not the flash-fast SSDs you find in modern hyper-converged appliances. The Smart Array P440AR can spin up RAID 5 or RAID 6 without a lot of CPU overhead, which is fine for workloads that are more compute-bound than I/abound. However, if you plan to run databases, high-transaction web services, or VDI sessions that demand low latency, you'll feel the 7.2K spin time. In my experience, adding a separate NVMe or SATA SSD for the VM boot volumes makes a noticeable difference, while keeping the SAS array for bulk storage. The server itself doesn't ship with an SSD slot, but you can use the PCIe slots to add a dedicated storage controller if you need faster tiered storage. Network connectivity is one of the stronger practical points. The bundled HP Ethernet 10 gigabits 2-port adapter means each virtual switch you create in your hypervisor can get a full 10 gigabits line without having to buy a separate NIC. For a small office that already runs a 10 gigabits backbone or plans to upgrade soon, this eliminates a common bottleneck where dozens of VMs fight over a single 1 gigabit link. The downside is that you have to configure VLANs or SRIOV manually. The card isn't plug-and-play like some consumer NICs, so you'll spend a few hours in the BIOS and driver setup. Once it's done, though, the throughput feels smooth even when you're moving several gigabytes of backup data across the network. Power consumption and heat are also worth mentioning. Dual 800W redundant supplies sound overkill until you actually load the CPUs and spin up all 4 drives. Under a typical virtualization workload, say 10 VMs each using 24 vCPUs, the server hovers around 350W, which is reasonable for a 2U box. The real issue appears if you run it at full CPU utilization for extended periods. Power climbs past 500 W and the fans spin up louder. If your rack is already hot, you'll need to make sure the cooling infrastructure can handle that extra heat load, otherwise you'll see thermal throttling that defeats the purpose of buying a high-end CPU. So who should buy this machine? First, any organization that already has a rack, a UPS, and a plan to run multiple VMs on a single host will find the DL380 a practical way to consolidate hardware. It shines for lab environments where you need to test patches, run CI pipelines, or spin up temporary Windows Server instances for training. It also works for a small private cloud.